The late afternoon sun hung low over the vast stretch of the Florida Everglades, casting golden streaks across the shallow waters and jagged sawgrass. A single mother in her early 30s, energetic yet weary from the weight of life's struggles, sat behind the wheel of her car as it hummed along the quiet road. To her friends, she had always seemed unstoppable, balancing work, parenting, and the chaos of everyday life with a smile that rarely wavered. But beneath that smile was a longing, a pull towards something bigger than routine. That longing had led her here, to one of the wildest, most unpredictable landscapes in America. She had told her sister she needed just a few hours to herself, a quick hike to clear her head before returning to the world of obligations and endless responsibility. Her car slowed as she reached a narrow pull-off by a trailhead that only the locals seemed to know. The air was thick, buzzing with mosquitoes, heavy with the scent of damp earth. She shut off the engine, gathered her small hiking pack, and for a moment just sat there, staring into the expanse of wilderness. It was both beautiful and unsettling, a place where silence carried weight and every rustle of grass hinted at hidden movement. She took a deep breath, adjusted the straps of her pack, and stepped out, locking the car behind her though her purse and keys remained inside. She had no plans of being gone long. The first steps onto the trail felt liberating. She was free from the noise of traffic, from ringing phones, from her child's constant but beloved demands. The crunch of gravel underfoot echoed into the void, the sound quickly swallowed by the vast openness of the swamp. Egrets stood motionless like statues in the shallows, their eyes following her as she moved. The sun pressed down hotter now, and the air seemed to close in tighter around her with each passing step. As she walked deeper, she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Not by people, there was no one else here, but by the wild itself. The Everglades were alive, teeming with creatures she couldn't see. Alligators could be lurking beneath the still waters, snakes coiled in the underbrush, panthers prowling unseen in the distance. She tried to ignore the unease, focusing instead on the stillness and the rare chance to think without interruption. For her, this wasn't just a hike. It was a rare escape, a reclaiming of herself. She stopped to sip from her water bottle, wiping sweat from her brow, and thought briefly about her daughter waiting back home. She promised herself she would return quickly, that this was only a short adventure, a breath of fresh air before stepping back into the current of her life. Yet even as she told herself that, something in the air shifted. The buzzing of insects dulled, the birds went silent, and the thick heat of the swamp seemed to grow heavier. She glanced over her shoulder. The path behind her was already swallowed by the reeds and shadows, her car just out of sight. A flicker of doubt crossed her mind, maybe this wasn't the safest place to wander alone. But she pressed forward, her boots crunching against the dirt, stubbornness outweighing fear. After all, she had faced harder things in life than a walk through the wilderness. Unbeknownst to her, time was slipping faster than she realized. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long across the trail, and the familiar landmarks vanished into sameness. Every bend looked like the last. She quickened her pace, the edges of worry curling into her thoughts. She wasn't lost yet, but the Everglades had a way of disorienting even seasoned hikers. When she finally turned back, intent on returning to her car, the silence of the swamp pressed against her ears. No voices, no engines, not even the hum of the outside world reached here. She was alone in the truest sense, alone with the unseen presence of the wild. Somewhere in the reeds, a ripple stirred, and unseen eyes tracked her every move. Back by the roadside, her car sat waiting, silent and unmoving. The keys dangled inside, her purse resting untouched on the passenger seat. Hours passed, the light faded, and the swamp reclaimed its secrets. By the time searchers would later stumble upon the vehicle, the trail of the woman who had sought only a few hours of peace had already gone cold. She had stepped into the heart of the Everglades, and then, as though swallowed by the land itself, she was simply gone. The discovery of her car had been the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Parked neatly on the side of the narrow Everglades road, it looked as though its owner might have just stepped away for a moment. But the details were off. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, the keys still inside, and a bottle of water only half finished in the cup holder. For detectives, it was the kind of scene that sent a chill through the spine. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints that could be traced clearly in the sandy soil, and no obvious direction in which she had gone. It was as if she had vanished into the swamp without leaving the faintest clue behind. Search efforts began immediately. Deputies, park rangers, and volunteers fanned out across the dense landscape. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights piercing through the sawgrass and mangroves as the daylight faded into night. Airboats skimmed across the shallow waters, their engines echoing into the distance as handlers with dogs scoured the trails. Still, nothing surfaced. No piece of clothing snagged on a branch, no shoe half buried in the mud, no sign that she had even been there beyond the abandoned car. The Everglades, with their sprawling beauty, proved to be a formidable adversary. Unlike the forests or mountains where searchers could track broken branches or clear trails, this terrain was deceptive. Water masked tracks, mud swallowed evidence, and predators lurked just beneath the surface. Every volunteer who stepped into the swamp felt the weight of danger. Alligators slid silently through the murky water, their eyes glowing in the beams of flashlights. Cottonmouth snakes curled in the underbrush, nearly invisible until it was too late. Each movement carried risk, yet the search pressed on because a mother's life depended on it. Her family made desperate pleas to the public. On local television, her sister's voice cracked as she begged for anyone with information to come forward. Flyers with her smiling face were posted at gas stations, diners, and trailheads, the words, "Missing," printed in bold above her name. Her daughter, too young to fully grasp the gravity of it, asked when her mother would be home. Friends tried to reassure her, though their own hearts carried the heavy suspicion that answers might never come. Days bled into weeks. Leads trickled in but led nowhere. Some callers insisted they had seen a woman matching her description hitchhiking along a highway. Others swore she had been spotted at a gas station outside Miami. Detectives chased down each report, but all ended in dead ends. The more time passed, the more the theories grew. Some believed she had wandered too far and been claimed by the swamp, perhaps dragged under by an alligator or trapped in the mud where no one could find her. Others suggested foul play, that someone had intercepted her during her solitary walk and left the car as a decoy. As the months stretched on, her case began to fade from the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher mysteries. Still, her family refused to let her memory slip into silence. They held candlelight vigils, posted updates on social media, and organized small search parties even when the official efforts had slowed. Each new season brought with it a renewed push, though always with the same result: silence from the Everglades. Detectives admitted privately that the swamp itself was often the greatest suspect. People vanished here more often than the public realized. The Everglades were vast and merciless, and once they took someone, they rarely gave them back. Whether it was disorientation, wildlife, or accidents, many who stepped too far into the wilderness never returned. And yet, there was something uniquely haunting about this disappearance. Her car was too intact, her belongings too neatly arranged. It gave the impression that she had simply walked away, but walked into what? A year is a long time for a family to wait without answers. By the anniversary of her disappearance, hope had begun to fracture. Some clung to the possibility she was still alive, perhaps having started a new life elsewhere. Others braced themselves for the inevitable truth, that the swamp had claimed her in a way no one could prove. What no one knew, not yet, was that the Everglades were holding on to a secret far stranger and more grotesque than anyone could imagine. Nearly a year had passed since the woman's disappearance when the Everglades stirred again with whispers of something unusual. Wildlife officers, who regularly patrolled the wetlands to monitor invasive species, spotted movement along a remote section of marsh. At first, it was just another Burmese python, one of the many non-native giants that had devastated the ecosystem for decades. But this one was different. Stretched across the reeds like a living river, it was massive, easily over 18 feet long, its girth thicker than a man's thigh. What truly caught the officer's attention, however, was the unmistakable bulge swelling in its midsection, distorting the smooth lines of its body into something grotesque. The Everglades had seen their fair share of pythons consuming animals they shouldn't: deer, alligators, even family pets dragged in from nearby communities. But this bulge looked unnatural, elongated in shape rather than rounded like the body of a hog or the bulk of a gator. The sight of it unsettled even the most experienced handlers. The snake writhed sluggishly, its movements slowed by the enormous weight it carried inside. Locals who had gathered at a safe distance whispered among themselves, trading rumors before the officers even acted. Some said it must have swallowed a wild boar, others guessed a calf from a nearby farm. But the longer they looked, the more uncomfortable the officers became with the possibility that neither explanation was correct. With practiced caution, the team moved in. One officer hooked the python behind its head with a pole, while others pinned its muscular body in sections along the ground. Even subdued, the creature was frightening in its sheer power, thrashing with enough force to splinter branches and churn mud. Sweat ran down the men's faces as they worked to subdue it, their boots sinking into the muck with every step. Finally, with ropes and heavy restraints, the beast was secured. Still, it was that bulge, the unnatural lump in the center, that no one could stop staring at. The decision was made to transport the python back to the wildlife station for examination. The swamp was no place for what had to be done next. Struggling to load the massive reptile onto a flatbed, the men felt the unnatural shape shifting within the snake's belly, as though the creature itself knew the weight of its secret. The air was heavy with unease, and though no one dared say it aloud, the thought was there. Gnawing quietly at the edges of their minds, what if this was not an animal? Word spread quickly. By the time the python reached the station, reporters had already caught wind of the capture. Cameras flashed as the restrained snake was carried into a secure area, each photograph capturing the disturbing outline of what lay within. The bulge protruded in sharp angles that looked almost wrong, as if bones beneath the skin were pressing upward. Some swore they could make out the faint suggestion of a shape that was all too familiar, a bent curve like an arm, a bend like a knee. Inside the examination room, silence blanketed the team as they prepared. Knives were laid out, glinting under harsh fluorescent lights. The officers who had wrangled the snake stood aside, their expressions grim, as biologists stepped forward to begin the work. One of them, with years of field experience, admitted later that he had never felt dread quite like he did in that moment. Cutting open a python was routine for the department, they had dissected hundreds. But this one carried with it the heaviness of something far more sinister than an overfed predator. As the first incision was made, the snake shuddered, though securely restrained. The blade slid down the belly, peeling back thick scales and sinew. The bulge pressed outward, straining against the cut, and within moments, the room filled with a stench that made even the most hardened officials gag. Slowly, the shape inside was revealed, and the faint outlines became unmistakable. The body within was not shaped like deer or hog, nor any wild animal of the Everglades. It was unmistakably human. Gasps filled the room as the team exchanged horrified glances. The reality they had dreaded was no longer speculation, it was fact. Nestled inside the python's gut was the curled, partially preserved form of a person. Clothing still clung in fragments, fabric twisted and stained, while around the wrist gleamed something metallic that caught the light. A bracelet, one that would soon be recognized as belonging to the woman who had vanished nearly a year before. The room was heavy with silence, every pair of eyes locked on the grim discovery. It was not just the solving of a mystery, it was the uncovering of a nightmare no one had dared to imagine. The Everglades, after holding its secret for months, had finally given up its answer, but in a form so grotesque, so shocking, that even the most seasoned officers would never forget the sight. The room was hushed, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead as the incision widened along the python's belly. Every eye followed the slow, deliberate movements of the biologists, though more than one officer had already looked away, unable to stomach what was unfolding. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a sour mix of rotten bile that clung to their throats and burned their eyes. Even those accustomed to death in the wild found this unbearable, because this was not the remains of a deer or wild hog. This was something unmistakably human. The body inside was curled unnaturally, compressed into a fetal position by the snake's constricting coils and the crushing pressure of its stomach. The flesh was pale, bloated, and partially digested, but the outline of arms, legs, and even strands of hair were visible. Bits of clothing clung stubbornly to what remained, a torn blouse, shredded fabric that had resisted the python's digestive acid. It was grotesque, surreal, like a nightmare given physical form. Then came the detail that sent a shiver through the room. Around one wrist, still clinging despite everything, was a simple bracelet, tarnished but recognizable. It was a piece of jewelry her sister had described in interviews months before, a silver charm. Bracelet she wore every day, a gift from her daughter. When one of the detectives saw it glint under the harsh lights, His voice broke as he whispered, "It's her." The confirmation was instant, undeniable, and it silenced the last remnants of hope that perhaps this discovery had been something else, something less horrific. As the remains were carefully extracted, the python's body sagged flat, its grotesque secret removed. The scientists worked with a grim professionalism, gently placing what they could recover into forensic bags. The snake's stomach had preserved far more than anyone would have expected after nearly a year. The swamp's unique conditions, combined with the reptile's own biology, had left behind a chillingly intact form. The bracelet, the fragments of clothing, and even partial skeletal remains would later be catalogued, each piece adding to the story of what had happened. For those in the room, however, there was no comfort in the science of it. The reality was too raw, too horrifying. Some officers stepped outside, gulping down fresh air as though they had been suffocating. A few whispered prayers, unable to reconcile the brutal image with the smiling woman they had seen on missing person posters. Even the wildlife officials, hardened by years of dealing with invasive predators, admitted later that they had never witnessed anything so grotesque, so viscerally shocking. News of the discovery spread with lightning speed. Within hours, local channels were reporting the find, their voices trembling as they delivered the details. The remains of a missing woman have been found inside a Burmese python, anchors said, the words sounding almost too unreal to be true. By evening, national outlets had picked up the story, and soon it was splashed across headlines worldwide. The world was both horrified and captivated. Photos of the massive snake, restrained with ropes, circulated online, alongside grainy images of the bulge in its belly. The speculation, the whispers, the endless questions, it all reignited with a feverish intensity. For her family, the confirmation brought both relief and devastation. Her sister, who had begged for answers for months, collapsed into tears upon hearing the news. At last, they knew where she was, what had happened, and yet the knowledge was almost unbearable. Her daughter was shielded from the worst of the details, but the loss was undeniable. The mother she had waited for, the woman who had promised to be home after just a short hike, would never return. Authorities pieced together their best theory of what had happened. The woman had likely wandered too close to the water's edge, where the python lay in wait. These snakes, though not venomous, kill with terrifying efficiency. Coiling around their prey, they squeeze with enough force to stop the heart, crushing ribs and suffocating in minutes. Once subdued, the victim is swallowed whole, headfirst, disappearing into the snake's body as if consumed by the swamp itself. That was the grim fate investigators now believed had befallen her. Yet even with the discovery, questions lingered. How had she not seen the snake in time? Did she cry out for help, or had the swamp swallowed her screams as easily as it had hidden her body? Could she have been injured before the attack, making her vulnerable? No one could say for certain. What was clear, however, was that her disappearance had not been the work of a criminal or a tragic accident alone. It had been a rare, chilling intersection of human fragility and the raw, merciless power of nature. As the python's remains were taken away and the woman's body delivered to the medical examiner, those who had witnessed the unveiling knew they would never forget it. The bulge in the snake, the glint of jewelry, the unimaginable reality of what they had found, all of it was seared into their memories. The Everglades had kept its secret for a year, but when it finally revealed the truth, it did so in the most shocking way imaginable. The discovery should have brought closure, but instead it opened the door to a storm of questions, speculation, and lingering horror. When the medical examiner confirmed through DNA that the remains were indeed hers, the family was caught in a cruel paradox. Finally, they had answers, but the reality of those answers was unbearable. The bracelet, the fragments of clothing, the way she had been found, all of it painted a picture so grotesque that her loved ones struggled to reconcile it with the woman they had known. A vibrant, loving mother reduced to something swallowed and hidden within the belly of a python. It was a truth that seemed more like a nightmare than fact. Her daughter, too young to grasp the full weight of what had happened, asked questions her family couldn't easily answer. Why didn't mommy come back? Where is she now? Her sister and parents shielded her as best they could, but the child sensed the heaviness around her, the way the adults' voices faltered, the way they avoided speaking of certain details. For them, the horror wasn't just in the discovery, but in the attempt to explain the unexplainable, to make sense of a death that no human mind could fully process. Authorities held press conferences to share what they knew. They explained how Burmese pythons, invasive and thriving in the Everglades, were capable of swallowing prey larger than most people believed. Wildlife officers spoke about how rare such an attack on a human was, how unlikely it was that this would ever happen again. Yet the words did little to ease the unease. If it had happened once, people reasoned, could it not happen again? The Everglades, already known for its dangers, alligators, venomous snakes, disorienting terrain, now carried an even darker reputation. The idea that something so immense and merciless could consume a person whole sent ripples of fear through communities that bordered the swamp. Journalists and documentary crews descended upon the story. They filmed the lonely road where her car had been found, interviewed tearful relatives, and shot sweeping drone footage of the endless marshlands that had concealed her for so long. Every detail was scrutinized, from her decision to hike alone to the theories about how the python had taken her. Was she attacked while kneeling near the water? Did the snake strike from the reeds while she paused to take a sip from her bottle? The questions multiplied, but none could be answered with certainty. All anyone knew for sure was that she had vanished into the wilderness, and when the Everglades finally gave her back, it was through the stomach of a predator. For her family, the aftermath was marked by both grief and anger. Some directed their fury at the spread of Burmese pythons, creatures that should never have been in Florida to begin with. Others blamed the slow response of the initial search, convinced that if someone had looked harder, sooner, perhaps she might have been found alive. Most of all, there was a helplessness, the realization that no amount of vigilance or effort could have changed what had happened in those fateful moments. The swamp had taken her, and there had been no saving her. Her disappearance and discovery sparked heated debates in the state about invasive species control. Wildlife officials renewed their push to hunt and eradicate pythons, emphasizing the ecological devastation they caused and the danger, however rare, to humans. Hunters were dispatched more aggressively, and stories circulated of competitions where cash prizes were awarded for capturing the biggest snakes. Still, for every python removed, dozens more seemed to appear, breeding and thriving in the humid expanse of the Everglades. Yet for those closest to her, the political debates and ecological battles were just noise against the personal tragedy. They mourned not just the brutality of her death but the loss of her future, the birthdays she would miss, the milestones her daughter would face without her. At memorials, friends remembered her laugh, her warmth, the way she had carried herself through life with resilience despite its challenges. The circumstances of her death loomed over every gathering, but those who loved her fought to remember her as she had been, not as she had been found. Even now, the story lingers in the collective imagination. The photograph of the python, restrained with ropes, is burned into memory, a grotesque symbol of the unknown dangers that lurk just beyond the borders of civilization. For some, it remains a cautionary tale, a reminder that the wilderness, however alluring, carries risks beyond comprehension. For others, it is a haunting unsolved riddle, because in truth, no one will ever know the exact details of her final moments. Did she see the snake before it struck? Did she fight? Or did the swamp claim her so swiftly that she never even had the chance? The Everglades remain unchanged, vast and unyielding, a place where secrets can be buried for months, even years. And though her story has been told, dissected, and sensationalized, the unanswered questions echo on. Closure came in the most grotesque way possible, but closure did not erase the pain. Instead, it left behind a chilling reminder that nature can be both beautiful and merciless, and that sometimes, the earth holds onto its mysteries until it decides to reveal them in ways too terrible to imagine.